the Zulu Declaration of Self. The Zulu Declaration, the Zulu Declaration of Self, eloquently states the following: I am sovereign of my life. I am sovereign of my life. My neighbor is sovereign of his life. My neighbor is sovereign of his life. Society is a collective sovereignty. Society is a collective sovereignty. It exists to ensure that my neighbor and I realize the promise of being human. It exists to ensure that my neighbor and I realize the promise of being human. I have no right to anything I deny my neighbor. I have no right to anything I deny my neighbor. I am all. I am all. All are me. All are me. I can commit no greater crime than to frustrate life's purpose for my neighbor. I can commit no greater crime than to frustrate life's purpose for my neighbor. I can commit no greater crime than to frustrate life's purpose for my neighbor. MAAT, and order in African cosmology. MAAT and order in African cosmology, a conceptual tool for understanding indigenous knowledge. A conceptual tool for understanding indigenous knowledge by Denise Martin, University of Louisville. MAAT is a comprehensive construct that existed throughout ancient Egyptian civilization. In its cosmological sense, MAAT is the principle of order that informs the creation of the universe. In its religious sense, MAAT is a goddess, or Natur, representing order or balance. Last, in its philosophical sense, MAAT is a moral and ethical principle that all Egyptians were expected to embody in their daily actions toward family, community, nation, environment, and God. Last, in its philosophical sense, MAAT is a moral and ethical principle that all Egyptians were expected to embody in their daily actions towards family, community, nation, environment, and God. This work extends MAAT beyond the boundaries of ancient Egyptian culture and tests its conceptual elasticity by developing it into an analytical tool for studying classical African cosmological knowledge and how it relates to cultural expression. It focuses on the conceptualization of MAAT as the foundation of the universe, and then uses the manner in which MAAT appears in ancient Egyptian culture as a basis for distinguishing patterns within classical African knowledge. This pattern contains 10 characteristics or dimensions: sacred, symbolic, visual, functional, moral, oral, communal, rhythmic, multidimensional, and holistic. This pattern contains 10 characteristics or dimensions: sacred, symbolic, visual, functional, moral, oral, communal, rhythmic, multidimensional, and holistic. Generally speaking, studies of MAAT can be classified into two categories: those that discuss MAAT within the context of ancient Egyptian civilization, and those that extended the concept of MAAT beyond ancient Egyptian civilization. The first category contains the majority of the literature and reflects the various textures of Ma'at as it existed in ancient Egyptian civilization. Here, we find discussions of Ma'at as the cosmic or divine order as it appears in ancient Egyptian literature, as a goddess depicted on monuments, and as an idea of personal morality and social justice. Although the majority of studies in this category discuss Ma'at in a social or religious context, a few have focused specifically on the epistemological aspect of Ma'at. The literature in the second category contains works that extend Ma'at beyond ancient Egypt. Some lean toward the application of Ma'at as a social and/or moral construct, particularly relevant to the study of African culture both in antiquity and modern times. Others discuss Ma'at in relation to Greek thought and culture. Essentially, the literature agrees that Ma'at represents a fundamental order of the universe that exists on both human and heavenly planes. But the diverse nature and scope of Ma'at fuels much of the discussion. Like the studies in the second category, this work uses Ma'at to establish a pattern of knowledge in various classical African societies. What are the shapes and dimensions of this pattern? How do these dimensions influence the conceptualization and expression of knowledge in various cultures? Using a Ma'atian approach allows the conceptualization and expression of knowledge to be discussed in a new context. Kwasi Wiredu hints at this process when he speaks of the conceptual decolonization of African knowledge, which calls for the reviewing of any such thought in the light of indigenous categories as a first step, and as a second, evaluating them on independent grounds. Premise for Ma'at as an analytical instrument. Forming a framework for discussion, classical African knowledge using Ma'at has two main premises. Forming a framework for discussion, classical African knowledge using Ma'at has two main premises. First, there appear to be an intimate and mutually dependent relationship between cultural production and cosmological beliefs among various cultures on the continent. The similarities are not necessarily aesthetic, but ontological. Second, a theoretical framework that fully captured the complexities and indeed significance of the relationship between cultural production and cosmological knowledge was needed. African cultural production is a feast for the senses because of its rich storytelling, textile weaving, carving, constructing, dancing, singing, body adorning, and music-making traditions. But the metaphysical ideas that give meaning and context to the ceremonies, rituals, performance, and daily life created an intellectual pattern discernible through obvious cultural and environmental differences among African ethnic groups. This production is revealed to the Western mind through the focused lens of one discipline, such as art, philosophy, or anthropology, but the genius of classical African knowledge lies in how all elements of cultural production from all segments of life are integrated into an epistemological system. This integration requires an analytical tool equally comprehensive and elastic to discuss it. Using the concept of Ma'at allows this because Ma'at has simultaneous cosmological, social, cultural, and personal domains. The cosmological domain is where Ma'at is the totality of ordered existence, and represents things in harmony. The cosmological domain is where Ma'at is the totality of ordered existence and represents things in harmony and in place. This work will focus on the ordered existence of knowledge as it manifests in classical African culture. Forming the pattern. To date, there are no records from ancient Egypt providing a conspicuous definition of Ma'at. Only texts that reflect contextual applications of Ma'at. To date, there are no records from ancient Egypt providing a conspicuous definition of Ma'at, only texts that reflect contextual applications of Ma'at. These are found in the pyramid texts, declarations of virtues, the book of Kun Anup, the book of contemplations, and the autobiographies of the New Kingdom and late period. The previously mentioned texts detail how individuals, peasants, officials, and kings upheld, practiced, created, and lived Ma'at. From this, it can be said that Ma'at was already in use as an analytical tool throughout Egyptian civilization by the fact that it was operational in everyday life and the determining criteria by which an individual's life was justified. That Ma'at was actively practiced by all segments of society in no way diminishes its philosophical dimensions. Nor does the contextual shift between ancient Nile Valley and more recent cultural expression in Africa diminish its relevance for application. According to Congolese scholar Theophile Obinga, elements of Ma'at linguistically can be found in numerous African cultural groups. Meh, truth, justice, Coptic. Moyo, life, soul, mind, Congo. Ma, magic medicine, to know the truth. Ningbaka. Maya, to know. Mipongwe. And Mo, to know. Yoruba. Furthermore, Senegalese scholar Sheikh Anta Diop, when arguing for an African origin of civilization, identifies totems, circumcision, kingship, cosmogony, social organization, and matriarchy as key areas that support the idea that ancient Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa are variations of one cultural entity. Diop, 1991, has also traced the origin and development of pre-colonial African civilizations and societies to establish that they are connected by a distinct set of social, linguistic, historical, and political relationships that reach back to antiquity and span the continent. In reference to religious and philosophical ideas, John S. Mbiti, 1990, has acknowledged that although there are variations in beliefs, practices, and customs among people on the continent, there is a distinguishable African ontology among cultural groups. This ontology is primarily a religious one and consists of 5 elements: God, spirits, man, plants/animals, and phenomena. The acknowledgement and interaction among these elements provides a foundation on which to discuss the beliefs, practices, and rituals of African religions in general terms. Magesa, 1997, maintains that it is moral traditions that are modeled after maintaining the order created by God as being a basis for discussing African religious practices. Ghanaian philosopher Kwame Gyekye also states that there is an underlying cultural unity or identity of various individual thinkers that justifies references to varieties of thought as wholes, such as Western, European, or Oriental. Thus, space has been created for this type of speculative discourse about broader patterns of African culture. Space has been created for this type of speculative discourse about broader patterns in African culture. However, it must be acknowledged that when applying a concept across space and time, there is the hermeneutical tension between reading into and drawing out of. It must be acknowledged that when applying a concept across space and time, there is the hermeneutical tension between reading into and drawing out of. Karinga, 2004, page 26. In response, if one consciously maintains that it is a speculative application and, more important, avoids the notion of an ideal, this approach can be intellectually enriching. MAAT is not positioned as an ideal or the ideal for discussing African sacred knowledge. Similarly, it is not a standard, therefore determining which African cultures have a concept similar to MAAT and which do not is not the thrust of this work. It is a paradigm, a framework with which to consider how this knowledge is reflected in cultural production. Epistemological issues. As mentioned previously, a premise of this work addresses the issue of theoretical framework. This means more than an intellectual argument about what defines knowledge, but also includes the relationship between culture and the creation of knowledge. That is, how culture determines what is known, experienced, and understood as knowledge. Gyekye, 1996, argues that culture can be filtered out, leaving us with knowledge that does not bear any cultural footprint. The difficulty lies in trying to identify the cultural footprint of the current knowledge base or modern sciences, natural, human, and social, because they developed during the period of Western ascension and domination of global trade, politics, and culture. Therefore, what is understood and accepted as science bears the imprint of the Western intellectual and cultural experience. Harding, 1997, which Ani, 1994, argues contains the episteme of universality, but is in reality a culturally specific one. This tension between themes of universality and if or how they manifest in African cultures in particular has been an issue African philosophy as a discipline wrestled with in its infancy, Wright, 1984, and continues today, Grayton, 2003. Dialogues on the perception, sources, and structure of African knowledge in light of Western philosophical ideas gives us three major lines of thinking within African philosophy: traditional African philosophy, contemporary African philosophy, and Africana philosophy. Wordless, 2004. Each school has its conceptual boundaries, but each provides valid points for our discussion of classical knowledge. Most important are the conceptual decolonization by Wordless, previously mentioned, and Luscious Outlaws call for realizing the potential of geographical and conceptual flexibility afforded by Africana philosophy, provided there is realization that many professional philosophers suffer a consequence of our culturally anemic, race-tainted yet race-denying, logocentric and Eurocentric training. The near-exclusive focus throughout our training on canonical Western figures and texts as the paragons of philosophy, and the near-total exclusion of insights from such disciplines as history, anthropology, ethnology, psychology, theology, sociology, demography, epidemiology, political science, art, music, and dance leaves us all ill-equipped for working out appropriate conceptualizations to guide us in realizing the promise of Africana philosophy. This is where MAAT can be useful, because it allows for a full manifestation of sacred African knowledge to be recognized, while providing intellectual flexibility to explore new relationships. It allows the synergy of cosmological, philosophical, artistic, and social ideas, much like how they exist in classical African communities, to be interpreted in a systematic manner. Analyzing knowledge as it relates to the creation, maintenance, and restoration of sacred order reflects an alternative epistemological reality for classical African thought. Work is being done by scholars in both Africa and the diaspora that illuminates these relationships in knowledge. Definition of terms. Definition of terms. At this point, it is critical to define several key terms being used in this work. African. African is used in the composite sense, Asante, 1990, not as an extension of ethnicities or endorsement of biological determinism, but a cultural identity, as cultural identity. Classical is preferred to indigenous or traditional, and is used in the sense articulated by Karenga, 2004, in that it refers to both the chronology and achievement of African knowledge. Indigenous connotes a connection to place and ownership like traditional. It is often perceived as being opposed to, less than, or pre-modern or Western. Classical is understood as a historical level of achievement among a particular culture. Classical African knowledge is not less than, opposed to, or instead of Western knowledge. Knowledge is used in that it permits a broader scope for addressing more types of information than that which would typically be considered, using the rigid definitions required for thought to qualify as philosophy. Ma'at is defined nicely by Bulge, 1960, as goddess of the unalterable laws of heaven. This definition is profound because it encapsulates the epistemological core of this work. Ma'at as goddess means that the idea she represents is sacred in the collective mind of the Egyptians. Ma'at is identified, conceptualized, deified, and worthy of conscious praise and adoration. Thus, it becomes a part of the religious culture of the Egyptians. In addition, goddess recalls a time when civilizations were matriarchal in belief and practice. Diop, 1991, Wood, 1996. Last, goddess invokes an axiom of thought, or thought, which states gender is everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. Chandler, 1999, page 97. The Yoruba also adhere to this axiom, with each of the 400 plus 1 Orisha having a masculine or feminine designation. Next, unalterable laws implies both the permanence of Ma'at and the obligation of humanity to acknowledge, follow, and uphold these laws. This gives an ontological basis for Ma'at as the governing law for Egyptian society that focused on maintaining Ma'at. Last, of heaven gives a cosmic sense to the concept. Not only do we have the principle being a goddess, unchanging, and a mandate for humanity, Ma'at includes everything in the cosmos. Unlike the Judeo-Christian tradition where the law is believed to have been given to man by God and applied almost exclusively to human situations, Ma'at governs all aspects of creation. In ancient Egypt, the world was created using Ma'at and man as a consequence of creation and exists within this law. If man were not here, Ma'at would still apply. Ma'at as an analytical instrument. Ma'at as an analytical instrument. Each manifestation of Ma'at in Egyptian culture creates a specific dimension of African knowledge. These dimensions are distinct yet interrelated, much that Ma'at appears in Egyptian culture. The first dimension, the sacred or spiritual religious, is found in the Book of Knowing the Creations. The Book of Knowing the Creations, in which Ma'at exists before and informs the formation of the cosmos. According to Ra's description of his creation, when I came into being, being itself came into being. Heaven had not yet come into being. Heaven had not yet come into being. Nor had the earth come into being, nor had the ground been created, or the things which creep and crawl upon it. I raised up beings in primordial waters as inert things. I found no place on which to stand. I formed it from the desire in my heart and laid the foundation through Ma'at. Ma'at is the intention or thought of the Supreme, and everything flows from this intention. In speaking of Dogon thought, Gri Ayule and Dieterlin, 1986, state that this thought makes of the universe an orderly whole where the notion of law is less present than that of a pre-established harmony, incessantly troubled and continuously reordered. The pre-established harmony is MAAT. The orderly whole in which classical African knowledge operates is contextual and bound to the elements, workings, processes, and cycles of the sacred universe, not to an abstract law. Mbiti, 1990, affirms this when he says that Africans have a religious ontology. All reality and phenomenon, including knowledge, are understood in the context of this sacred cosmos, though in varying degrees. Another way to view this is that knowledge can have a simultaneous sacred and secular context. It must have relevance, correlation, and meaning in both realms. It must have relevance, correlation, and meaning in both realms. This echoes the principle of correspondence found in the teachings of thoughts, also from the Egyptian culture. As above, so below. As above, so below. As below, so above. Chandler, 1999. Another example that supports the sacred dimension of knowledge is the deification of MAAT. Which places it into the conscious mind of Egyptians as a focal point of reference and therefore relevant to their lives. Still, another sacred dimension is seen in the language in which Ma'at is written. In ancient Egypt, denominator translates as the God's words or sacred writing, using a translation from its better known Greek name, hieroglyphics. Words or language are sacred. In the sense that God created the words, or the words belong to God, along with writing itself, and what is said with them. Hence, there was an aspect of writing that was maintained by devout priests, scribes, for nearly 4,000 years. Gardner, 1994. Although the Egyptians attributed writing to God, the Nter, Thoth in particular, among the Dogon, knowledge has a more abstract origin, vessel, but also attributed to God Amma. For Amma had designed the universe, creating it. The material for the design was water, with which he traced figures in space. This is represented by an egg divided into 4 quadrants, each containing 8 master signs, each of which produced 8 more. The 256 signs are the complete signs of the world. The 256 signs are the complete signs of the world and represent the direct expression of Amma's thought. Unlike the Egyptians' hieroglyphs, Dogon signs are a series of curved, hook and sickle-shaped lines that can be drawn on the earth with stones, porridge, seed, or etched onto a door. Regardless of their physical form, the important factor here is that writing itself is sacred. The physical form of writing among the Egyptians and Dogon is the imperative for the next 2 dimensions of classical African knowledge, the symbolic and visual. The symbolic is the fundamental element of knowledge used by ancient Egyptians when representing their understanding of the universe. According to the definition put forth by Cali'sKALYpzo, 1978, when an image, a collection of letters, a word or phrase, a gesture, a single sound, a musical harmony or melody have a significance through evocation, we are dealing with a symbol. J. A. West, an avid student of Cali'sKALYpzo, explains symbol further. It is a means of bypassing the intellect and talking straight to the intelligence of the heart, the understanding. The glyphs that compose the word Ma'at are depictions of material items found in Egyptian culture: a pedestal or wedge, a sickle, loaf of bread, feather, forearm, tied roll of papyrus, and 3 vertical lines. The lines indicate that the concept should be understood 3 times, or they indicate importance. It is generally held that the glyphs are to be interpreted for their phonetic value. However, Karenga, 2004, suggests that the wedge pedestal denotes evenness. Ma'at is presented visually as a silhouette of a seated woman with a feather atop her head, a woman with a feather for a head, or simply a feather. The woman denotes the feminine and goddess characteristics of Ma'at mentioned previously. The feather is a symbol of Ma'at because it evokes the concept of the lightness of heart experience that is the consequence of practicing Ma'at. Ma'at is evoked through the symbol of the feather. According to Grialu and Dieterlin in 1986, the development of Dogon thought, and hence the elaboration of concepts, proceeds by analogy and has constant recourse to the symbol. The symbol is also the conveyor of knowledge. It will have led man to collect materials and actions in his memory, but it will have familiarized him with games of abstraction. Page 459. Again, like the Egyptians, the abstractions are found just behind a common everyday item, and it only takes a small amount of the everyday item to evoke the full power of a concept. A simple feather for Ma'at and a single grain of sorghum in a plate of rice infuse the qualities of the grain. Among the Akan of Ghana, there is a similar use of the symbolic, because they use the adinkra cloth and its symbols as visual markers to express their worldview, beliefs, attitudes, and thoughts. In this collection, symbols have a specific name, meaning, and accompanying proverb. The word adinkra means to part or say goodbye, and implies a message a soul takes along when leaving the earth. Willis, 1998, page 29. Interestingly, in ancient Egypt, images and words regarding Ma'at appear in the chambers of the deceased, therefore not intended as messages for the living. Closely related to the symbolic is the visual dimension of knowledge, whereas symbol is the process or mode of production, the visual is the product. Though a written language can be visual and words technically are a type of symbol, this dimension includes the art forms, images, sculptures, structures, shapes, textiles, patterns, prints, movement, and so forth. Ma'at can inform the visual aspect of knowledge in 2 ways, as an aesthetic or subject matter. According to Finch, 1998, existing Egyptian structures reveal a precise intention as to their location, orientation, material composition, and purpose. Furthermore, every single glyph painted or etched onto walls, columns and ceilings would first be carefully measured, sketched, then filled in or carved. The lines and angles on structures are precise. The hieroglyphs are symmetrical, perfectly shaped, and consistent. And speaking of the approach to architecture, Finch explains it this way. The civilizations and cultures of antiquity never lose or lost their awe of nature. The idea of imposing the will of man upon her was beyond conception. Thus, the edifices erected by the superlative now valley architects of antiquity seem not merely to bend with the landscape, but emerge from it. You heard me? The builders took extraordinary pains not to distort the landscape in any way. The material form of civilization was subsumed by nature. Furthermore, grand structures such as the pyramid complex at Giza, the temple at Karnak, the temple of Ramses, because of their orientation to specific stars and synchronicity with movements of the sun, bear an aesthetic of Ma'at. Ma'at can also be subject matter. The weighing of the heart scene depicted on the papyrus of Ani shows Anubis balancing the heart of Ani on one side of a balancing scale with a feather, symbolic of Ma'at, on the other side. If the deceased lived in accordance with Ma'at, his or her heart would be a little lighter than the feather. If not, Amimit, shown as a composite of various beasts, sat ready to devour the heart of the deceased. Other forms of African art can also display this dual approach to visual knowledge when considered in its indigenous context. For example, among the Bamana of Mali, the door locks serve to regulate Niyama, the vital energy that resides in all creation, which can be manipulated by Sa'ubaya, sorcery. The locks, through their public display and embellishment with Tiu, graphic signs or pictographs, also reflect a Bamana intent to use them to teach and remind people about the essential religious and philosophical beliefs and values of Bamanaya. The Sowo mask of the Sande community among the Mende also serves to reinforce a spiritual message. Each element assembled to make up Sawo has its own reflections in Mende thought and conduct, and each augments and extends the meaning of the whole. For us to understand all of this will require no less than a study of the natural and metaphysical background from which the forms emerge, forms which we shall unveil part by part, meaning by meaning. Boone, 1986, page 153. Both the door locks and the masks have a specific aesthetic that govern the creation of its physical form. Yet each are a physical materialization of cosmological knowledge, and each plays a specific literal, symbolic, and vital function to the well-being of the community. Generally speaking, traditional African art was inspired by legends, myths, tales, and proverbs, served religious functions, and included assorted items such as figurines, jewelry, body art, pottery, house posts, and textiles. Adejumu, 2002. The relationship between the inspiration, intent, form and function of traditional art can be described as an application of Ma'at. Forms, tones, and textures in African art are expressions of the people's perception of the world around them. In short, they are portrayals of their ways of knowing and collecting aesthetic preferences. As a result, the works are often used to evoke order, tranquility, and continuity in community life. Page 167. Returning to the weighing of the heart scene, it also illustrates the moral dimension of knowledge because it shows Ani being presented before Asar, Lord of Resurrection, justified for eternity because he practiced Ma'at. Although this scene shows the journey of a soul after death, there are ample examples of Ma'at being applied as a standard for the living. In the Book of Kunanup, also referred to as the Eloquent Peasant, there's a petition of a farmer to a high steward to follow the principles of Ma'at in consideration of the case. This story is important because it shows how Ma'at permeated every segment of the Egyptian population. Jacob Carruthers, 1986, illustrates this sentiment in the depiction of how Ma'at is applied to governmental and administrative policy. The same Ma'at that informed creation was the same Ma'at to which Kemetic government officials were bound. Another example of Ma'at that presents the moral dimension of knowledge is found in the Declarations of Innocence. These statements clearly identify which actions individuals should avoid in their lifetime so that their way to the gods not be blocked. Though there is a contextual shift from the realm of the cosmic to the communal, the Zulu Declaration of Self, along with a seemingly inexhaustible supply of proverbs dealing with good and just behavior, affirm the value and place of morality in many African societies. Diekeye, 1995, Madu, 1992, Mbiti, 1992, Wangohi, 1997. There's an aspect of Ma'at in which good speech is equated with doing Ma'at. Unlike the modern Western axiom that boasts actions speak louder than words, both a person's words and their actions will weigh on the scales of judgment. The oral dimension, like the visual, has an aesthetic component as found in the beautiful speech of the Eloquent Peasant, or the Book of Kunanup. Although the content was about Ma'at, the words were also spoken beautifully, and it was recorded for subsequent generations to appreciate. A more speculative aspect, or oral knowledge, exists in the fact that despite the hieroglyphs, Midunatern, that saturate the tombs and temples and fill numerous scrolls of papyrus, information on astronomy and building techniques for the Sphinx and pyramids remain hidden from the written word. Perhaps this information was part of an extensive oral tradition. Although this remains a mystery, other cultures have fashioned a complex oral tradition that includes not only the widespread practices of storytelling and use of proverbs, but also libation, songs, chanting, drumming, and divination. Ma'at reveals the functional dimension of classical African knowledge because it integrates the sacred with a mundane or secular situation. Ma'at as manifestation. Ma'at as manifestation. The philosophical idea actualized in thought, speech, behavior, creating, building, and living give each a broader meaning and context. In traditional Akan culture, the Adinkra symbols would be stamped onto cloth and worn during a funeral. If the cloth was commissioned, the craft person would counsel the patron on the use of appropriate symbols to use. Arthur, 2001, page 27. These symbols represent concepts in categories such as God's universe, self, government, beauty, love, family, community, ethics, and wisdom. The cloth would then simultaneously communicate a message from the wearer to the departed and the community. The simple act of wearing clothing in public becomes an expression or function of the cosmological knowledge of the culture. This leads to the next dimension of knowledge. Which is communal. Returning to Ma'at, though the individual soul was justified for living Ma'at, it was the community on earth that received direct tangible benefit. It was the community on earth that received direct tangible benefit. This dynamic relationship between individual action and communal consequence reverberates throughout African cultures. The Zulu Declaration of Self eloquently states the following: I am sovereign of my life. My neighbor is sovereign of his life. Society is a collective sovereignty. It exists to ensure that my neighbor and I realize the promise of being human. I have no right to anything I deny my neighbor. I am all. All are me. I can commit no greater crime than to frustrate life's purpose for my neighbor. Among the Akan, there is an Adinkra symbol, Funtumereku, which depicts two crocodiles sharing a common stomach. The accompanying proverb states, the crocodiles struggle for food that goes into the same stomach. 1995 interprets the two heads as individual thought, action, expression, and the common stomach as the basic interests of both. This stomach also represents the community that is nourished by individual actions. This nature of community is also expressed in the Akan proverb. The clan is like a cluster of trees which, when seen from afar, appear huddled together, but which would be seen to stand individually when closely approached. Page 158. Although there is a distinct emphasis on the communal, it exists in constant tension with the cause of the individual. Knowledge that has a communal dimension does not automatically negate the individual or her capacity for knowledge, nor does it presuppose that the community is a rigid totalitarian monolith. It instead proclaims that knowledge occurs in a human context. The collective well-being of these humans is the purpose of the creation, dissemination, and application of knowledge. This approach is supported by Mbiti, 1990, who states that an African ontology is anthropocentric, and in addition to the 5 elements, there is a force that permeates the whole universe to which some humans have access through spirits. Through this force, the elements are balanced and maintained. Through this force, the elements are balanced and maintained. This is another example of MAAT. With humans at the center of this sacred universe, the charge befalls them to maintain the balance within it by controlling its fet, or disharmony. This constant flow of harmony to disharmony to harmony again indicates a subtle rhythm that provides the rhythmic aspect of classical African knowledge. Ma'at, translated as harmony, has inherent implications for rhythms because both relate to music. The role of Ma'at in reconciling tensions, maintaining the delicate and ever elusive order, provides a cosmic cadence to life, to which everything keeps time. Of course, there are solar, stellar, and lunar cycles tracked by many communities that are often discussed as elements of mathematical time, but they are in essence rhythms. The Dogon celebrate the Sigil ceremony every 60 years, which equals 1 day in the celestial procession year. In addition to these pre-established celestial rhythms, there are the more commonly considered polycentric movements and rhythms of African dance and music, which are expressed during rituals, festivals, and life celebrations. These rhythms facilitate the continuation or reestablishment of harmony within an individual, family, clan, village, or nation. Rituals are the instruments that play these rhythms because rituals help prevent and reconcile disharmony. Among the Yoruba, the Ebo, or sacrifice, arranges the powers of the universe in a person's favor. Using our metaphor of rhythm, the individual in essence calls the tune when she makes the sacrifice with all of creation as the instruments. Among the Dagara, the funeral ritual serves as a time for the entire community to not only mourn the dead, but to release pent-up grief, despair, frustration, and guilt for any of life's challenges. After grieving, the ceremony takes a festive tone because the human psyche needs to play. So May 1994, page 71. The musicians are responsible for triggering the release of appropriate emotions. Traditional knowledge is polyrhythmic because it simultaneously negotiates human, familial, communal, earthly, and celestial rhythms. The polyrhythmic quality of knowledge is echoed in its multidimensionality. Though it is generally acknowledged that many traditional African cosmologies have the seen and unseen as major categories, this dualistic 5-sense-driven description of reality is limiting because it leaves us with just two options. This dualistic 5-sense-driven description of reality is limiting because it leaves us with just two options. There are other realms that must be considered. The unseen realm is usually that of the spirits, But there are reports of encounters with phenomenon that are physically real phenomena, but do not originate in the physical world or the spiritual world. Instances such as altered states, dreams, visions, and life forms from other dimensions are acknowledged as sources of knowledge. So May 1994. Because MAAT connects all, creation is inherently multidimensional. That nothing is left disconnected in the system shows that classical African knowledge is holistic. That nothing is left disconnected in the system shows that classical African knowledge is holistic. The declarations of innocence contain references to familial, communal, spiritual, and ecological relations. The Zulu Declaration of Self involves a complex network of psychological, biological, social, and spiritual interactions. The modern world has tremendous knowledge about psychology, sociology, religion, and geology, but little about what connects these areas and the nature of the connection. Is there a pattern, ritual, or story that makes them collectively relevant? Returning to Ebo, a person must prepare a sacrifice that can involve any combination of plants, foods, alcohol, animals, and objects. Though most items are found in nature, they will most likely require interaction with various members of the community to obtain. Once the orishas have been quote-unquote fed with the items at a ceremony, which often involves still other members of the community, the sacrifice is removed from the altar and left at the crossroads, the intersection between human and divine, material and spiritual, and sacred and secular. All of nature participates in Ebo, including the bird or animal that may enjoy a nice meal courtesy to the offering while symbolically carrying the message into the sky and within the earth. Ebo. Ebo is an example of an African approach to phenomenon that integrates elements from diverse areas. Ma'at. Ma'at allows for this holistic expression of knowledge because it allows relationships between sacred and secular, esoteric and exoteric, material and spiritual, individual and communal, spoken and written, and danced and drummed to be explored. Conclusion. Ma'at as an analytical tool addresses the complexity of human intellectual, artistic, religious, social, personal, and spiritual existence. It opens up new possibilities for understanding and exploring knowledge in a comprehensive context. Ma'at by no means represents an absolute or total understanding of African cosmology, nor does it have to address solely African phenomenon. What Ma'at does is provide a theoretical framework for which encounters between the academic disciplines of philosophy and dance, or botany and religion, can occur. Much like the synergy that exists within many traditional cultures. Call and response Q&A, question and answer, new dimension, essential aspects of life, health, action, art, family, culture, heritage, breathing, diet, exercise, rhythm, motion. This is what scientists will consider a paradigm shift, the tipping point. We are on a sojourn, at the onset, the plinth, the zenith, horizon, meridian, on the outskirts of the very ridge, of the ledge, of the edge, faced with the arrival of evolution, forced and faced in human consciousness, with an arrival of evolution, human consciousness, a reconstruction of awareness, the divine designation of this new dimension, a next dimension, another level of seeing, another level of being, thinking, living, the enhancing advancement of reality. Most probably believe in the possibility of many realities, several conclusions. The applicability of the general individual may argue that reality is relative, that there very well exists everyone with their own truths. Zen enthusiasts might insist in the principle of a one universally natural and exclusively supreme and supremely absolute and absolutely true. What are the others saying? That another ain't? How do these two relate? And where originates the dichotomy, bridging the debate. Today, we explore. Life, we explore. Evaluate. Examine. Investigate life. As we know it, life. As a whole. Life as a whole.